Jacob and I were talking yesterday, like, holy cow, we have to go after that. So please bear with us. The other thing that you need to know is that this is my very first attempt to try to make something out of some of the research that I've just started for my new book project, which is environmental and urban history of the food industry in Minneapolis. But of course, it extends well beyond the boundaries of that city, and hopefully you'll get a little taste of that today. It also means I need your help. That's kind of a PS. So please bring on the critique. It's necessary. It's necessary. On December 24th, 1926, a Minneapolis-based barbershop quartet stepped up to a radio microphone. The live Christmas Eve spot for the local radio station capitalized on the ongoing barbershop singing craze. The radio station, recently purchased and renamed by the Washburn Crosby Company, the largest maker of white flour in the world, had hired these singers to give about 40 seconds of catchy advertising for a new product.
Maybe.
Okay, I'm going to share the lyrics. The song went something like this. Have you tried Wheaties? They're whole wheat with all of the bran. Won't you try Wheaties? For wheat is the best food of man. They're crispy and crunchy the whole year through. The kiddies never tire of them, and neither will you. So just buy Wheaties, the best breakfast food in the land. The first commercial jingle in world history worked. Wheaties sales picked up across the listening area. Soon, the nascent National Broadcasting Company, NBC, began broadcasting this quartet nationally. For the next 3 years, the four men earned $15 a week to sing the jingle live on the air. The product that they hawked represented a new direction for a flour industry facing hard times. Since the 1870s, Washburn Crosby, alongside many other flour milling companies, had harnessed the energy produced by falling water at the Mississippi River's largest waterfall to make high-quality white flour sold the world over. The industry not only made flour, but also turned Minneapolis into one of America's largest cities, and indeed in 1892 it hosted the Republican National Convention. This milling industry simultaneously transformed the ecology of the center of North America. Driven by the so-called mill cities' demand, a wheat monoculture replaced the diverse grasslands of the northern plains, the kinds of grasslands that we just drove through, replaced all that diversity with a monoculture. High-protein, hard spring wheat grown there made it possible for Minneapolis to make flour for the world. Yet by the early 1920s, cultivating wheat in the city's hinterland became untenable. Climatic shifts and plant diseases combined with collapsing crop prices forced thousands of farmers off their land. Meanwhile, the production and transmission of electricity made it possible to power flour mills anywhere, ending the Minneapolis millers' energy monopoly. Finally, the white bread flour the millers sold, stripped of bran and sold as an especially pure source of nutrition, troubled the interior of human bodies. A decades-long epidemic of dyspepsia that afflicted hundreds of thousands with indigestion, acid reflux, constipation, and even ulcers led to vociferous calls to improve the nation's digestion through the addition of fiber to daily diets. Washburn Crosby's Wheaties, introduced in 1924 as the company's first non-flour food product, emerged as the company's response to these intersecting environmental crises. Its eventual success made it a prime example of a new strategy for the Minneapolis millers, one premised on diversification, integration, and value-added processing. And it was those dynamics that would fuel the transformation of Washburn Crosby into General Mills, Inc., now the largest maker of packaged foods in the world. Wheaties, a cold breakfast cereal, solved problems facing the Minneapolis milling industry, even as it altered intestinal landscapes and promised to prop up a failing wheat monoculture on the northern plains. The early years of this late-coming breakfast cereal offers a new window into the environmental history of the Great Plains. The development of Wheaties encompassed cultivation, production, distribution, and consumption. While most histories examine the cultural and economic aspects of emerging food systems, ecological effects also stand out. Intertwined geographies proved especially important, and Wheaties encompassed dynamics that tied together a city and a hinterland, as well as the human innards of thousands of consumers far from the northern plains. Flaked breakfast cereal represented a novel industrial manipulation of the grain grown across the region. Transforming kernels of hard spring wheat into a packaged breakfast cereal entangled farmers and soil and railroads, machinery, corporate executives, engineers, marketers, consumers, and once again, human intestines. Wheaties created novel patterns of ecological circulation, reconfiguring the ground, good-for-you foods, and guts alike. The rise of a wheat monoculture in the northern plains lay at the center of the story. Minneapolis' emergence as the world's flour milling center grew from the late 19th century transformation of an ecologically complex grassland into a monoculture landscape. After whites confined the diverse native peoples of the regions to reservations or expelled them altogether, railroads began connecting the Midwest to the Pacific. Their success depended on the government-subsidized sale of land to settlers. Construction inefficiencies on those railroads, multiplied by corruption and mismanagement, could not undercut the successful marketing of wheat-focused agriculture as the future for many families and as the mainspring of settler colonialism. Thousands of European Americans flooded into the region. Experimentation with wheat seeds, especially in the prairie provinces, led to the eventual creation and adaptation of marquee hard spring wheat across the region. By 1918, farmers had planted over 20 million acres of this seed, from Nebraska to Saskatchewan and from western Minnesota all the way into Montana and Alberta. The resulting wheat kernels found their way to the shores of the upper Mississippi River via the railroad. At St. Anthony Falls, migrants from New England used their connections to Boston-centered capital, as well as industrial espionage, and of course savvy marketing, to create a process for industrializing ways of making a new, highly desirable bread flour, and of course, build a city. These millers emphasized what they called the progressive processes that allowed them to separate the bran and the germ from the wheat kernel's endosperm. And in doing so, they also transformed diets. Campaigns touting the purity and quality of their proprietary high-protein wheat flour led to claims that it made for better, whiter bread. Now, these magazine advertisements, I think, are especially important, and in the broader project, I'll, of course, unpack the power of these images, the ways in which they're gendered, the ways in which domesticity is associated with purity, and, of course, the significance of whiteness. The significance of whiteness in the flour was absolutely crucial because flour was a consumer product that throughout the 19th century was understood to be often unpure. There was often moments where people who milled flour could add adjuncts to kind of stretch it out, just to be able to sell more product, including other forms of plant material, sometimes waste material. I've even read of clay being used as an adjunct. So this notion of purity was really important to consumers and was, in many ways, the Minneapolis millers' claim to fame. And purity was directly related to whiteness. And I found this last week, and I just could not pass on sharing it with you, because this, obviously, there's a whole host of things happening in this image. This is Pillsbury, Washburn Crosby's big competitor, from the 1890s. This advertising card in the back kind of laid out Pillsbury's various products. But of course, what this image identifies is the racialization of a host of global so-called consumers. The Uncle Sam figure is conflated with Pillsbury. And in many ways, this shows how Minneapolis had taken settler colonialism, the fruits of it at least, and was transforming it into something that would create a racialized international empire for the United States. I'll just linger a little bit longer on that. Interestingly, consumers across North America and Europe in particular agreed with the marketing. They believed that, in fact, Minneapolis flour was better, and it was, because of the processes that had been developed there. These millers had transformed the power of falling water and prairie loam into caloric and economic power. And they used that economic power derived from the milling of wheat to establish subsidiary businesses, most notably in Buffalo, New York. And of course, they took over half of the Canadian wheat trading market in Winnipeg by 1915. But it was the Washburn-Crosby Company that stood above all the other millers, even Pillsbury, as the city's most successful corporation. Meantime, on the Northern Plains, longstanding calls for agricultural diversification fell on deaf ears during the World War I wheat boom. In the conflict's wake, the effects of uneven rainfall, depressed commodity prices, a fungus known as wheat rust, and reduced exports rippled across the Northern Plains. Recurring droughts left already depleted soils dry in the early 1920s. The end of the Great War reintroduced European and further encouraged South American wheat producers to engage in global markets, leading to more wheat on those markets. The intensity of wheat monoculture and the dedication to it by the region's farmers left those farmers' fields in the Northern Plains more susceptible to disease, and of course extracted nutrients from the soil without replenishment. Commodity prices plummeted in the early 1920s as international demand for wheat and wheat products weakened. As early as 1920, growing production costs and shrinking yields convinced some in South Dakota to abandon wheat cultivation altogether. In 1921, the dean of Montana's Agricultural College argued that a lack of consistent rainfall in the eastern portion of that state made dryland wheat farming impossible without extensive irrigation. By 1922, Northern Plains farmers, not just in South Dakota or Montana, but across the region, knew that something had to give. Rex Willard, an economist at North Dakota Agricultural College in Fargo, noted in this article that wheat farming across the Northern Plains was, at best, a, quote, risky business, end quote. He argued that farmers needed to embrace radical changes to continue to survive as agriculturalists on the plains. He had engaged in a careful study of over 100 farmers over 5 years, and his study seemed to make it clear that concentrating risk in a single commodity, draining the soil nutrients, as well as monoculture's susceptibility to pests, simply made wheat farming as a long-term project untenable. And thousands of farmers began to depart their region, largely because of these conditions, not because of the calls, but because of these conditions. It was so bad that in 1923, Plains and Prairie politicians even held what they called a wheat conference in Chicago to identify solutions for what they described as the, quote, dissatisfied condition of a large portion of our agricultural population. Quote. Problems in the city's hinterland further complicated pressing issues facing the Minneapolis millers in the early 1920s. There had been wartime flour rationing, and in fact, that wartime flour rationing during World War I in the United States had been organized at the federal level by Washburn-Crosby's own vice president, James Ford Bell. The resulting decline in home baking reduced consumer demand for white bread flour in years after the war. Furthermore, the wheat rust that was ruining crops on the Northern Plains was forcing the Minneapolis millers to look for actual grain outside of the hinterland that they had largely controlled. Special federal railroad freight rules that favored Minneapolis as a milling center and also undergirded the emergence of Minneapolis as a milling center ended. And in the meantime, special rules continued to apply to Buffalo. I'd be happy to talk about those in the Q&A, making the milling concerns there especially competitive with Minneapolis. But the biggest challenge to the Minneapolis millers came from these new ways to power milling machinery. By the early 1920s, the emergence of networked electricity started to change everything because an emerging power grid ensued widespread access to energy. This is the old way of things. So here you see St. Anthony Falls. This is what is now downtown Minneapolis. This is the east bank of the Mississippi. This is the west bank. Pillsbury, the Pillsbury A mill was right here. The Washburn-Crosby complex of mills was here. You can see that above the falls, there's a mill race that's powering turbines in each of these, and then the race is returned to a main tail race that then goes back out into the river. Here, I've inscribed what was the Pillsbury kind of underground mill race powering a turbine and then the discharge back into the river. This St. Anthony Falls area had been transformed in very powerful ways to become, no longer provides everything plain old electricity as you and I know it. This system was being rendered obsolete. And so, because they had once been tied to localized hydromechanical power, millers all across the country seized on the opportunity to not have to deal with all this, and instead to power their machinery via coal or hydroelectric powered grids. Again, it was Western New York that benefited most from the emerging electricity infrastructure, because Buffalo in particular drew on the massive hydropower grid that was starting to emanate from Niagara Falls. That ensured that it cost a third less to mill flour in the Queen City than in Minneapolis. Now, one way that these Minneapolis millers started to band together was to coordinate prices for their flour, illegally, in 1923. But price fixing could not solve the underlying problems, which were structural. And furthermore, price fixing attracted unwanted attention. Subpoenaed by a U.S. Senate-sponsored investigation in 1925, the Minneapolis millers refused to cooperate, and they stalled the challenge in the courts well into the 1930s. Most importantly, the millers began to rethink their business. A flaked, cold breakfast cereal featuring wheat bran, the very part of the wheat kernel that the entire city's milling industry had worked to efficiently eliminate, offered another way forward. Fiber offered a clear solution to a national epidemic situated in people's abdomens. And as an overarching condition that included nearly everything that might go wrong in an intestinal tract or stomach, dyspepsia, again, afflicted hundreds of thousands of people. Reformers believed that a new vegetable and fiber-rich diet they called biologic living could cure most dyspepsia. This way of thinking emanated from Battle Creek, Michigan. John Harvey Kellogg, in particular, running a kind of health, the stomach, its disorders, and how to cure them, which came out in 1896, and Constipation, How to Fight It, which came out in 1915. These books, along with books by others, brought new ideas about diet to a broad audience across the United States and indeed the rest of North America. Kellogg and others harangued consumers for their diets of heavy proteins and over-refined carbohydrates. One reformer associated with Kellogg argued that, quote, constipation is man's deadliest enemy. It kills more people than war, famine, or pestilence, unquote. Kellogg himself believed that what he referred to as the civilized colon, found in urbanizing industrial nations, ruined human health. For Kellogg, answering nature's call more often and changing what one ate were the only solutions. Now, the call from fiber that came from Kellogg's Battle Creek, Michigan sanatorium in the 1890s centered on breakfast. It centered on a particular meal. Ready-to-eat cold cereals doused in milk, according to Kellogg and these other reformers, offered a healthier alternative than eggs and meat, which is what I had for breakfast this morning. One of Kellogg's patients, Charles William Post, introduced both postum and grape nuts to a welcome audience around the turn of the century. After years of research, Kellogg's brother introduced cornflakes in 1906. It's important to understand that cold breakfast cereal also required this liquid for it to go in. And in the 19-teens, new research argued for the significant nutritional value of pasteurized cow's milk. Picked up by nutritional scientists, the call for a new American diet, especially at the breakfast table, became a central public health concern. Cereals, these cold breakfast cereals, flooded the market as entrepreneurs tried to cash in on changing consumer desires. Driven by the assurance that cold cereal doused in milk might eliminate dyspepsia, these reformers reinvented the American breakfast. It was an entrepreneur in Buffalo who created the first commercially available wheat flake cereal. It was called Force, and it came out in 1901. Apparently, it was later exported to Great Britain, so I found this crazy website of Force aficionados in the UK. I, of course, had never heard of it before. It didn't really have much of a consumer market beyond the Northeast and apparently the UK. It was not a nationwide phenomenon. Force, I mean, what a name. Force. The early 1920s and the dietary fiber craze that emerged as a result of all this talk about clean living and guts that actually worked meant that the American Medical Association got in on the act. In the 1920s, the American Medical Association starts publishing a journal for a popular audience. It was called Hygeia, and in the early 1920s, Hygeia clearly laid out the ways in which bran could help people live more healthy lives. And indeed, it created what Hygeia called a quote-unquote national mania around. The Vice President, James Ford Bell, ordered the creation of an experimental, quote, packaged goods, end quote, division. And significantly, that this division focused its research on quote-unquote cereal byproducts. The research around cold breakfast cereal in particular emerged from an idea brought to the company by a private sanatorium owner in North Dakota. The reformer's wheat gruel mix, cooked on a hot surface, made little wafers, perfect for breakfast cereal. He patented the process, and then his lawyer approached Washburn Crosby as a potential partner. So James Ford Bell, as the VP of the company, directed his chief miller, George Cormack, as well as this inventor, to take up the challenge of mass producing these little wafers. Research suggested in the Washburn Crosby labs that these flakes were satisfactory until they went into the package, because there they settled to the bottom and left the box mostly empty, and it's very difficult to sell a mostly empty box. Except that he didn't. After freeing the Washburn Crosby company from any related legal entanglements, Bell quietly told his chief miller to keep working on the wheat flake. The miller closely examined the process used by cornflake manufacturers, industrial espionage. Again, I can't prove it, but they poked around. And the chief miller tried 36 different varieties of wheat. Eventually, Cormack created a physically uneven flake that combined cracked wheat kernels with malt syrup, sugar, and salt. The cereal held up in taste testing, and most importantly, in the package. Meantime, Walter M. Ringer, a regional grocery wholesale executive, further convinced James Ford Bell in early 1922 that the future of the Minneapolis flour industry lay in what he referred to as, quote, cold packaged cereal, quote. Bell then hired Ringer to run Washburn Crosby's new packaged foods division. And so while his chief miller went off to design a factory for making the wheat brand-based breakfast cereal, Ringer, the new addition, this grocery merchandiser, focused on packaging and marketing and distribution. The two processes went on simultaneously. And March 1923 saw Washburn Crosby announce the building of a cereal plant in Chicago to focus on what they called, quote, the packaged cereal field on a large scale, quote. The product itself, what we know today as Wheaties, finally rolled out in 1924. Soon thereafter, it was first known as Gold Medal Flakes. Soon thereafter, an employee's wife won a contest to rename the cereal Wheaties. Touting the right amount of bran for proper digestion, as well as the full food value of the wheat berry retained in the whole wheat flake, salesmen immediately began selling the new product. Now, privately, this is James Ford Bell. Privately, James Ford Bell, now the president of Washburn Crosby, described the entire cereal division as a trial by Washburn Crosby, quote, to ascertain consumer acceptance and distribution, end quote, of a food product with lower production and marketing costs than white bread flour. But as the first non-flour product made by Minneapolis' largest miller, the cereal drew attention. Bell soon learned that the company's chief Minneapolis-based rival, Pillsbury, immediately began examining cereal options of their own on the other side of the river. Luckily for Washburn Crosby, reports came back that Pillsbury's experiments regarding the development of a wheat flake were not, quote, very satisfactory. Though Washburn Crosby came late to the cold breakfast cereal market, Wheaties represented a value-added product. Furthermore, it introduced new efficiencies in production. Where bread flour required the careful separation of bran and germ from wheat kernels, breakfast cereal simply, once again, required cracking open kernels, exposing the insides of those kernels to heat and pressure. The profit margin for cereal proved much higher than for flour. Breakfast cereals of every sort, cold breakfast cereals, were cheap to produce after initial investments in machinery, and their sales depended mostly on marketing. Packaging made it easy to both target and cultivate consumer audiences, and the national brand craze of the 1920s, fueled by many consumers' hope that fiber would soothe their indigestion-riddled digestive tracts, made the cereal's potential profitability obvious. In order to encourage sales, Washburn Crosby turned its back on its Minneapolis-based ad agency and gave the Wheaties account to a Chicago advertising firm that had more specific experience in the packaged food business. And after a long study of grocery store display values, the admin from Chicago rolled out an advertising campaign in October of 1925. It touted Wheaties as bodybuilding, as you see here, and as nature's most perfect food. The message was replicated on the boxes themselves, which claimed the cereal was a quote, unquote, perfect food. Initially, however, sales grew slowly. Now, there were other things that Washburn Crosby did as a result of this impulse for experimentation driven by these intersecting crises. In particular, it was the purchase of a radio station, Minneapolis' first radio station, as a way to reach consumers for all of the company's products, a new and novel way to reach them. The first thing that Washburn Crosby did was expand and rebrand the station as WCCO, Washburn Crosby Company, in March of 1925. And the advertising possibilities of this newfangled technology seemed to prove endless. Washburn Crosby executives got the idea to sell Wheaties over the radio, using that commercial jingle that debuted in 1926. From initial testing and experimentation with a newly created fictional character named Betty Crocker, who shared, at first, just recipes over the radio. That was a figure that would become more and more important in the marketing of General Mills products later on. But the cold breakfast cereal offered an opportunity, as one executive put it, to, quote, find out what that radio station of ours is good for, end quote. And after broadcasting that jingle, local sales of Wheaties in whatever market that jingle played in went up sharply. Expanding beyond jingles, Washburn Crosby continued to emphasize marketing and soon focused on children as a distinct consumer market for their food products. The company sponsored radio shows by the early 1930s featuring Skippy and Jack Armstrong, and indeed the Lone Ranger. In the early 1930s, advertising Wheaties again transformed both the company's approach and the product itself, or at least the packaging of the product, because a new Wheaties campaign centered on the sponsorship of professional baseball started to put athletes on cereal boxes. This is the first time an athlete appears on a cereal box. It's Lou Gehrig. And of course, it's the first time you see the Breakfast of Champions on the box. That had started in Minneapolis Millers Park. It was a minor league team in Minneapolis in 1932. It just takes 2 years for them to figure out to take it to the box, to the package itself. When they did this, sales skyrocketed. In 1936, a young baseball broadcaster from Iowa named Ronald Reagan even won a popularity contest sponsored by Wheaties, so that association between Wheaties and baseball broadcasting was already deeply embedded by 36. That popularity contest, which the young Ronald Reagan won, included a trip to California. And when Reagan went on that trip, he took a screen test with Warner Brothers. The rest is history. By 1941, Wheaties claimed 12% of the nation's breakfast cereal market. Wheaties not only saved Minneapolis' largest milling company, but transformed it into a primary player in America's burgeoning food industry. After a failed 1928 buyout, James Ford Bell purchased flour milling companies in Missouri, Oklahoma, Montana, Kansas, Texas, Michigan, and California. He consolidated operations to take advantage of modern power generation, reestablished the company as General Mills, and expanded the company's packaged food division. Bisquick came out in 1930. Kix cereal came out in 1937, and Cheerios, originally Cheerios, came out in 1941, joining Wheaties on the store shelves. Diversification through scientific research and industrial technology ensured that General Mills, at least according to the Wall Street Journal, became the only quote-unquote important food company to reward shareholders with profit through every quarter of the Great Depression. And the Wall Street Journal reporter also suggested that that success of General Mills stemmed from, quote, aggressive merchandising and advertising, and quote, as well as, quote, packaged products. Long-standing competitors copied the innovations of General Mills as best they could, and of course, after World War II, the emergent food systems they pioneered transformed global eating and ecologies. But what about those Northern Plains farmers? General Mills, like all the other Minneapolis flour companies, needed them to stay on the land and produce wheat cheaply. At first, Wheaties seemed to ensure that this demand would continue. Yet as James Ford Bell expanded General Mills' geography of production to other regions of the United States in the late 1920s and early 1930s, His company's dependence on Minneapolis' wheat hinterland, as it had been defined in the late 19th century, gradually faded. Indeed, General Mills even went out of its way to oppose federal legislation long desired by Northern Plains wheat farmers, the McNary-Haugen Act. It was essentially a form of federal price supports for farm commodities, and wheat farmers in the Northern Plains in particular were desperate to have this federal support. Calvin Coolidge, as President of the United States, vetoed that legislation twice, with the support of businessmen like James Ford Bell. A few years later, General Mills executives vociferously opposed the Agricultural Adjustment Act, one of the very first changes that came in the New Deal in 1933. That law, of course, provided some relief for Northern Plains farmers, but according to General Mills' own documents, it cost the company $110,000 a day. And finally, what about America's intestines? Barraged by bran in the 1920s, those intestines nonetheless found a little salt. The ongoing dyspepsia problem sparked further exploration of the effects of dietary fiber on digestive tracts. Experts agreed that roughage remained crucial for intestinal health, but they began breaking down dyspepsia into its constituent illnesses: ulcers, indigestion, acid reflux, and constipation. The range of treatments for these maladies available for post-World War II patients broadened through the adoption of pharmaceutical solutions. And of course, intestinal troubles persist today, as do those calls for more dietary fiber. So-called natural alternatives to processed food, pushed then as now by processed food makers, continue to promise healthier digestion. The range of locations swept up in the world that Wheaties initiated reminds us that food systems not only embody particular political economies, but also represent attempts to reorganize material relationships over a wide range of spaces with ecological and social effects. Wheaties' gradual success signaled a new way forward for the threatened Minneapolis flour industry. The new brand-centric wheat cereal targeted unruly digestive tracts and further ensured that wheat products would continue to serve consumers despite changing consumer tastes. But in many ways, the wheat farmers of the Northern Plains were left behind. Something.
Helping us this great event. I've really enjoyed all the papers I've heard the last couple days. And thanks, of course, to our organizers for bringing us all together. All right. How does this work? Forward. And I'll figure it out. I don't have that. Okay. Beginning in the early 1950s, an industrial-scale cattle feeding industry appeared on the southern Great Plains of the United States. Although the practice of fattening cattle on concentrated feed grains in the months prior to slaughter had a long history, these new feedlots housed tens of thousands of animals rather than the mere hundreds that had fed in earlier installations in the Midwestern Corn Belt and elsewhere. This increased intensity of cattle feeding created economies of scale that made the operations more efficient, but it also magnified the environmental consequences as foul odors and effluent troubled neighbors downwind and downstream. Moving into the 1960s, these new operations challenged existing tradition of common law solutions to nuisances, eliciting action from legislatures and courts. Environmental regulations and nuisance lawsuits threatened the cattle feeding industry, prompting responses from cattle raisers organizations in the southern plains states, including Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. While they frequently exercised their ability to influence state legislation to their advantage, feedlot operators discovered that the best defense against legal action was to locate in sparsely settled regions, a criterion the southern plains suited perfectly. Large-scale cattle feeding in the southern plains benefited from a number of changes to agriculture in the region over the course of the 20th century. Landowners began to tap the waters of the Ogallala Aquifer to irrigate their fields. The expense of this equipment prompted farmers to replace much of their wheat with more valuable and thirstier crops such as sorghum and corn. Feeding these grains to cattle produced huge quantities of beef to fill the supermarket shelves that served the booming and newly prosperous American population. Annual U.S. beef consumption increased from around 50 pounds per capita in 1945 to a peak of 91 pounds in 1974. It's currently about 55 pounds. If you're curious. Grass-fed beef no longer satisfied consumers' desires for tender, marbled cuts. While a mere 2.2 million cattle, 5.1% of the nation's herd, were on feed in 1935, that figure reached 28 million head by 1978. The expansion of paved highways allowed trucks to circumvent the railroad terminal centered meatpacking industry that had dominated since the mid-19th century. Packing plants followed the feedlots to the southern plains. Unlike their predecessors in the Midwestern Corn Belt, these industrial feedlots were massive full-time operations, housing tens of thousands of cattle. The increased scale of these newer operations gave them greater efficiency, but the concentration of cattle created concentrations of labor and other nuisances. Prior to the mid-20th century, nuisances from cattle feeding operations escaped the attention of legislatures and were largely governed by common law solutions. This legal tradition, inherited from English precedents, relied on the rulings of judges and local custom rather than the dictates of legislatures. It protected and encouraged users that developed resources in a productive manner, which were also frequently the users that created the most profound environmental changes. Much of the reasoning of this law failed to adequately protect new feedlots from neighbors who complained of the nuisances they created. To defend themselves from legal action, feedlot operators located areas with few neighbors and sought solutions from their state legislatures. Kansas led the way in developing industrial cattle feedlots in the Southern Plains. Earl Brookover observed feedlots near Bakersfield, California in the 1940s, and opened his lot near Garden City in 1951. Fittingly, the Sunflower State also led the way in regulating feedlots. In 1963, Kansas passed an act establishing a licensing procedure for its virgin cattle feedlots. Codifying the distinction between the new industrial feedlots and their part-time predecessors, Kansas defined a feedlot as a place regularly exported crops or other vegetation. All lots accommodating more than 1,000 head were required to pay an annual licensing fee. The fee was optional for smaller lots. While the act gave broad power to the Livestock Commission, it presented little in the way of mandatory penalties. The law showed as much concern for the control of cattle disease and pests as it did for the nuisances created by feedlot owners with pollution of lakes and streams. In addition, feedlot operators had only to adhere to the established practices in the feedlot industry to remain in compliance. While the Agriculture Commissioner could revoke the license of an offending feedlot, he had to wait for a complaint before taking action. In addition, the operator had the right to appeal any penalty to the Agriculture Board and convene a hearing in their home county. The legislation also promised assistance to Kansas feedlot operators. It required the Agriculture Commissioner to conduct research on feedlot operations and methods for abating pollution, and it obliged the state's universities to render assistance in this undertaking. The Commissioner had to make all such information available to feedlot operators and offer guidance as they set up their facilities. Perhaps most crucially, the first section of the law defined feedlots as agricultural enterprises. Although they were still subject to applicable zoning regulations, this definition would have critical implications for future feedlot litigation in Kansas.
It was the arrow buttons in the middle. There you go.
Oklahoma soon followed the example of its neighbor to the north. The Oklahoma Feed Yards Act, passed in 1969 with sponsorship from 3 Western Oklahoma legislators, read much like the Kansas legislation. It similarly required fees and licenses for feedlots, and it gave smaller operators the option not to be licensed. Rather than a single commissioner, the power to enforce the act rested with the Board. Agriculture is advised by a 5-member panel of feedlot operators. In other aspects of its regulation, Oklahoma's act mirrored the earlier legislation more closely. The board could investigate complaints against feedlots. The section covering duties of owners and operators listed the same 7 items and spelled out the required duties in medical language. These included removal of excrement, chemical control of pests, and otherwise adhering to the aforementioned established practices of the industry. Both Kansas and Oklahoma accepted compliance with the regulations as prima facie evidence that a nuisance does not exist. Passage of the Feed Yards Act received global support and cooperation from the Oklahoma Cattlemen's Association. The Oklahoma Cowmen, the OCA's official mouthpiece, concluded that the growth of Oklahoma's cities necessitated some action to avoid conflicts between cattle feeders and their neighbors. The Cowmen and other publications noted the Feed Yard Act's requirement that feedlots comply with the zoning laws of these expanding cities. The journal reassured readers that all regulations drawn up under the Feed Yards Act were based on the advice of the panel of cattle feeders, and emphasized the point that no feedlot licensed under the act would be construed as a nuisance. One OCA chairman observed that if we hadn't begun this work, someone not familiar with our problems would have done it for us. It would have made a law much more difficult to live with. The OCA also sought to use the Feed Yards Act to police its own ranks, as compliance would mostly burden the fringe operators who failed to adhere to industry norms. Such legislation concerning feedlots in many cases responded to a bevy of lawsuits that appeared here in the 1950s and 1960s. Several court cases throughout the Southern Plains states questioned whether or not these new industrial feedlots constituted agricultural enterprises and were thus eligible for the numerous privileges and exemptions afforded to such operations. In the 1964 case of Fields v. Anderson Cattle Company, a homeowning couple from the vicinity of Emporia, Kansas, sued the operators of 3 nearby feedlots for creating a nuisance. After a trial court ruled in favor of the homeowners, the feedlots appealed to the state Supreme Court. Their appeal rested on the argument that, as agricultural enterprises, the county's zoning regulations regarding nuisances did not apply. As the state's Feedlot Act had not been passed when the case first went to trial, no mention was made in the decision. Nevertheless, the majority of the court's justices agreed, and they maintained that feedlots had taken sufficient action to abate the nuisance. A dissenting opinion concluded that, unlike the precedents cited in the case, the feedlots did not constitute agricultural enterprises, as they were a mere 700 feet from the city limits of Emporia or well within the city's 3-mile zoning area. They should be enjoined from pursuing feeding operations. It noted, however, that what may be a nuisance in one location may not be a nuisance in another location. Bruce Winger, the Kansas lawyer who weighed in on the feedlot nuisance issue, found this lesson of location to be the key takeaway from the case, noting that the penalties initially levied against the feedlots decreased in proportion to the distance from the plant. In Oklahoma, when the legislature had neglected to define feedlots as agricultural enterprises while aiding a Kansas statute, the Supreme Court combined 3 cases, one each from Beaver, Texas, and Cimarron counties in the Panhandle. As it rendered a 1973 decision that concerned the payment of employment taxes, the feedlots contended that they were agricultural enterprises and therefore exempt, as they were essentially farmers or ranchers. To rule in favor of the feedlots, Oklahoma's Supreme Court found that not only contradict precedents, but also open all manner of enterprises, including livery stables and veterinarians, to the agricultural exemption, a move that went well beyond the intention of the legislature as the court saw it. The decision of the friendlier trial courts overturned the feedlots were ordered to pay their unemployment taxes. The disparity between the decisions of the county trial courts and the Oklahoma Supreme Court in that case reveals the importance of location in deciding matters of nuisance and agricultural enterprises. Bruce Winger noticed on the local scale differences of less than a mile in the case of Fields v. Anderson resulted in penalties varying by thousands of dollars. Location mattered on a larger scale as well. Feedlots in more rural areas of scarce population, particularly those in the newly established beef belt of the Southern Plains, generally face fewer legal obstacles than those in more urbanized locales. Feedlots near cities in eastern Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, on the other hand, often found their neighbors lack enthusiasm for their ventures. One of these feedlots, the Garland Grain Company of Dallas County, Texas, learned that local courts could be less than accommodating to alleged nuisances. Opened in 1960, the Garland Grain Company's feedlot became the subject of a nuisance suit in 1964 after several dozen neighboring homeowners complained of the resulting smell, flies, birds, and pollution of a nearby creek. The county trial court agreed and issued a permanent injunction against the feedlot. The Court of Appeals lifted the injunction and urged the plaintiffs to seek monetary damages instead. In this, the Court of Appeals followed a long tradition in American law favoring the most dynamic users of property, halting a productive business out of the question. Cash payments rather than real relief would have to suffice for homeowners. Although the feedlot prevailed in its appeal, the trial court's decision expressed the area's hostility to such enterprises in the future. Numerous cases in Texas show the growing resistance to feedlots in urban areas. A key case in the history of Kansas feedlot jurisprudence also involved plaintiffs who sought a complete injunction. A group of landowners in the area near Wichita, led by Earl W. Dill, sued the Excel Packing Company for allegedly creating a nuisance through the operation of a feedlot in valued neighboring land. 2 of the plaintiffs claimed that their land was suitable for subdivision and sale as home sites. Dill and Company also sought to halt the drilling of wells to supply water to the feedlot, as that was seriously impairing their water supply. The trial court granted the injunction, and Excel appealed to the Kansas Supreme Court. The court considered a number of facts in the case as it delivered its verdict. It found the claims of the homeowners that their land was suitable for subdivision to be spurious, as the area lacked sufficient water, sewers, and roads for such development. And as in many cases concerning feedlot nuisances, the court found that the prime factor which gives us pause in resolving this case is the location in which the operation of the feedlot is conducted. Being in a thoroughly agricultural region, the feedlot was a normal and reasonable use of land, and the flies and odors associated with it would be impossible to eliminate. The court, in overturning the trial court's injunction, offered stern rebuke to Dill and the other landowners for choosing to build their homes in an agricultural area, lacking zoning regulations. where cattle and hog raising, among other pursuits, have been conducted for some time. The court noted the landowner's desire to get away from the congestion of traffic, smoke, noise, foul air, and the many other annoyances of city life. But with all these advantages in going beyond the area which is zoned and restricted to protect them in their homes, they must be prepared to take disadvantages. The decision in Dill v. Excel serves as a precedent in many other Kansas nuisance suits. Maps. So, forgive the maps don't exactly show the same information that agriculture presents. Agriculture has an annoying habit of not always asking the same questions. And farmers didn't start tracking cattle and feed for a while. This shows generally where cattle were located. 1954, just as this feedlots were getting started in the Southern Plains. You can clearly see it around, Illinois, Iowa, eastern Nebraska. Where, if you've read Nature's Metropolis, you know that story. All the cattle in there, much smaller feedlots with maybe 50 to 100, a couple hundred cattle, but for short times on corn there, and then off to Chicago. Finale. However, so by 1974, this of agriculture is actually asking people about cattle fattened on grain concentrated in slaughter. You can see that there's definitely there's still a lot of cattle going on in Iowa and Illinois, but this Southern Plains region is definitely developing this cattle feeding industry. Then, nice enough, created this map since 2002. I guess they got tired of it. Eastern sections of the Plain States encountered legal obstacles. Their counterparts further west were based in Texas County, Oklahoma.
There's one on the.
You have fingers, though.
Yeah.
It's a small room.
That's a legend. Okay. That's Texas County right in the middle of the panhandle. There's a laser flare. Search the courthouse record in Texas County, Oklahoma, the heart of that state's industrial feedlot belt, revealed no nuisance suits against the major feedlot owners. Such a case in neighboring Beaver County, just east there, raised little concern from the cattle industry. One case in western Oklahoma did attract the industry's notice, though. Near the town of Alba, it's in northwestern Oklahoma, just before you get to the panhandle. A homeowners association sued the Sturberger and Baker feedlot, which had opened uncomfortably close to their rural neighborhood, resulting in odor and fly problems. The Oklahoma Supreme Court agreed with the homeowners in the decision of the trial court, issuing a permanent abatement to the nuisance. This last decision hit a bit too close to home for feedlot operators throughout the state. In 1993, the year after the Alba decision, an amendment to the Oklahoma Feed Yards Act clarified feedlots' responsibilities regarding offensive smells. Authored by a representative and state senator from the feedlot-heavy Panhandle region, the amendment stipulated that no feedlot could be deemed a nuisance unless it endangers the health and safety of others, provided it was located 3 miles outside of the nearest town and lay within a mile of no more than 10 residences. Mere foul odors would never again suffice to shut down a cattle feeding operation in the Sooner State. Although the amendment also enacted higher penalties than the 1969 Act, a $10,000 maximum fine rather than $100,000, with possible imprisonment, it substantially weakened the regulations themselves. With the issue of cattle feedlots largely settled, subsequent legislation responded instead to the hog industry, which expanded rapidly in the region during the 1990s. In 1997, the Confined Animal Feeding Operation Act largely supplanted the Oklahoma Feed Yards Act. Its advisory board included 3 operators, as had the Feed Yards Act before it, but it also required the input of several scientific experts, as well as some other government officials and members of the public. Originally called the Secretary of the Environment in Oklahoma to be on the board. There's no longer a Secretary of the Environment. It's Secretary of Energy and the Environment.
Mm-hmm.
4 years ago, I think. So, key change. This time, best practices of the industry received detailed explication, including the requirement that animal waste not come into contact with any state waters. Operators had to report all spills over 100 gallons and perform tests for various contaminants. A mandated pollution prevention plan had to include detailed studies of surface and groundwater, including training methods, and a log of all training and maintenance on the facilities. Crucially, however, the Act maintained the language in the Feed Yards Act, accepting compliance with the licensing process as prima facie evidence that nuisance does not exist, so long as it posed no health threat to others. Finding this legislation insufficient to deal with the burgeoning hog industry, in 2005, the Oklahoma legislature passed the Oklahoma Swine Feeding Operations Act, which set yet more rigorous standards for the controversial industry while sparing cattle feedlots. Neighboring states also had trouble with pigs. Colorado had a much more draconian law against hog operations that was starting out, and I think they kind of chased them out or kept them pretty restricted. While courts occasionally presented challenges to the cattle feeding industry by ruling in favor of aggrieved neighbors in nuisance suits, feedlot operators prevailed more often than not, generally protecting their status as agricultural enterprises and avoiding or winning nuisance suits in more sparsely settled regions, particularly the southern plains of the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles, western Kansas, and eastern Colorado. These lawsuits confirm the decision of the industrial feedlots to locate in southern plains, while punishing those that operate elsewhere. The cattle feeders held even greater sway in state legislatures, which passed lax or vague regulations when they acted to control the industry at all. These statutes dictated responses to alleged nuisances that overrode common law, which is appropriate difference. When more stringent legislation appeared around the turn of the 21st century, it largely targeted more noisome swine operations. Maintaining this political control in the future may prove problematic, however. The decline of rural populations means fewer neighbors to complain about the smell, but it also saps the political strength of cattle raisers. And competing water demands, whether it's from growing cities or oil and gas production, combined with the ongoing depletion of the overall aquifer, pose a looming threat to the cattle feeding industry on southern plains. Thank you.
Sure. Though you probably should have added with, that's all folks. Okay, as I promised yesterday, I am going to try to be somewhat brief since we're nearing the end. I wanted to thank Brian again for organizing all the things for today, and more importantly, thank Sam, the Osage Nation, for welcoming us here. We're very grateful for this opportunity. So, first a story. They led us into an auditorium-style classroom. And as we took our seat among the tiered rows, we looked down, but rather than seeing a finely polished stage, we observed a concrete floor tilted toward a large central drain. Hooks hung from the ceiling. And instead of a speaker's podium, there stood a stainless steel table. Once noticed, it was hard to turn away from its contents. A carefully configured collection of knives, saws, and cleavers. A Western soup course on the Inquisition? No. We were about to partake in Meat 101. Some 6 years ago, Texas A&M hosted the founding group of Food Waste Texas, and our festivities included an introduction to modern butchery. It was fascinating. Assistants toted in a huge side of beef, and I'm now fearful that it was that first steer gazing out from us in just
Probably.
And a professor of meat science broke it into its constituent parts for distribution, sale, and consumption. One observation struck me in particular: cattle raised in feedlots and also infused with antibiotics had grown to such sizes that the profession of butchering had changed. So, for example, now the cows were so loud, the steers were so large, that to have something that looked like a sirloin steak and have it be normal 8-ounce cut would make it a much thinner steak. Right? So there were all kinds of problems, and they were beginning to even invent new cuts of beef to be sold in the stores, new ways to convince consumers to eat their food. So Meat 101 reminded me of the unappreciated, often hidden ways in which industrialized food production has altered our consumption habits. And these papers by Michael and Jake tell us of the ways in which modern agribusiness employed the resources of the plains in production methods that transformed the dietary habits of Americans and others around the globe. And I commend them for their stellar contributions. Food constitutes an elemental relation between humans and the environments they occupy and engage. In the lead article for the famous 1990 roundtable in the Journal of American History, Donald Worcester noted that over the course of human history, quote, the most vital constant in concrete way, unquote, the people connected to nature was their pursuit of sustainable food sources and production systems. was to call for an agroecological approach to the field of the tightly argued paper about the central law that law played in not only promoting the development of large-scale feedlots, a new industry, but in ensuring the placement of these facilities in some of the region's poorest, most socially isolated, politically powerless, and sparsely populated areas. With few exceptions, state legislators generally classified these feedlots as agricultural activities, affording them certain protections. Moreover, regulatory schemes failed to employ police powers to protect the people living within proximity to these stench farms, yet alone the animals bred, born, fed, and slaughtered within their confines. Instead, the legislatures used the simple licensing of or other industry practices the applicable measure, a low bar of quality. Facing rock-bottom standards, feedlots frequently engaged in activities that led neighbors to pursue nuisance actions. In applying the common law, state courts sent a series of subtle messages. The courts implied that feedlots only constituted nuisances in more densely populated cities and towns, places that presumably maintained a certain middle-class standard of living. And as Jake correctly suggests, the court's frequent remedy of monetary rewards rather than equitable or injunctive relief allowed these nuisances to persist, confirming the corporate power, no matter how noxious its presentation, trumped pleasurable olfactory environments as well as safe drinking water. Jake's paper reminded me in many ways of Tracy Boyle's Wasteland. In that book, Boyles argues that the presence of uranium mining on Diné or Navajo land constitutes environmental racism. She contends that white settlers waste indigenous lands by crafting discursive constructions that targeted them for pollution. Settlers and colonial institutions then acted on these discursive constructions to make them material realities. Now, I don't want to push this analogy too far, because Boyle's arguments are rightly grounded in theories of settler colonialism. Yet in contemplating the towns, the regions, the areas targeted by these feedlot corporations, there is some sense of environmental disprivilege. A notion that lightly populated, economically struggling communities across the plains, these are marginal, worthless, and thus appropriately pollutable. I would love to know more about the demographics of these communities. I am confident that class issues will emerge, but I'd also be curious over the past 50 years how the racial makeup of these towns has changed. And really, how the racial makeup of the workforce in these feedlots have changed. I suspect that elements of environmental racism continue. And in that regard, Jake, you might want to take also a look at Carl Zimring's new book, Clean and White, The History of Environmental Racism. I think another way for Jake to elevate this terrific article is through greater contextualization. Perhaps a bit more about the history of cattle raising and grain production on the plains in the late 19th and pre-1950s era. And again, I'm not looking for a dissertation here, but rather something that gives the reader a clearer sense of whether the feedlots represent a distortion of or an evolution from earlier practices. In doing so, would also tie the paper more clearly to the plains as a production area. I also think it would be good to contemplate how these feedlots connect the plains to the larger world of meat consumption. You offered us some statistics, but there certainly is room for elaboration. One thing you might look at, and I know the Texas A&M has these, and I suspect Oklahoma State would be the reports put out by the USDA on the food triangle, and to see how the elements of that food triangle have shifted over time. And that would really speak to meat consumption. In the end, though, I want you to think about connecting these feedlots as you can more to the plains themselves. The plains as an environment, not just simply as a location for activity. Okay? Finally, Jake mentions the contested, well, I should say this, in his paper more than in the presentation, Jake discussed the contested, although ultimately successful efforts to classify large-scale feedlots as agricultural activities and thus subject to certain legal exemptions. And I think that's an important issue, how they're defined. But I wonder if you might give this article more oomph, and oomph, by the way, is a technical term used by historians. Yeah, oomph, more oomph, by pushing against that very privileging of agriculture. This is something we all probably should consider. Whether we trace this entitlement back to Jeffersonian mythology of the yeoman farmer, and I say mythology very purposely, follow it through 19th century land policies that in theory, if not practice, promoted farming on individually owned properties, or contemplate agriculture's absolution from labor laws enacted in the Progressive Era under the New Deal and by subsequent Congresses. This privileging has allowed agribusiness to grow, controlling large swaths of land, and often engaging in abuses of diverse environments, neighbors, and workers. And it's within this context of agribusiness that I turn to Michael Lansing's thoughtful paper, which integrates our four themes with wheat as the grass substitute, water and energy. I just lost my notes. Water and energy united in St. Anthony's Falls, and at least one animal, the human animal. Michael articulates how innovative product development and KG advertising allowed a regionally influential corporation, Washburn Crosby, to morph not simply into agribusiness, but into a global agro-behemoth, General Mills. I must say, Michael, you maybe provided my most disappointing moment of the workshop. When the audio failed, I expected you to sing. Not simply recite, but sing. Maybe recruit 3 others for a break. Michael argues that Washburn Crosby's introduction of Wheaties rescued the company from intersecting environmental crises, one on the plains, where climatic shifts, plant diseases, and falling prices undermined farmers, and the other in the human intestine, where finely milled white flour contributed to a dyspepsia epidemic. I really like that this paper attempts to connect the places of production to this quite visceral place of consumption, or maybe, should I say, digestion. Moreover, Michael's story highlights poor hinterland connection, something we haven't discussed much yet. The successful development of Minneapolis' rolling mill industry through the harnessing of the falls made possible the widespread monoculture of the farms in the Dakotas and other parts of the plains. And these were, of course, areas that had been rapidly settled under the illusion of a bonanza, fraudulently promised by railroads, as Richard White has eliminated. Roller milling broke the husk and separated the bran. Subsequent bleaching processes produced fine white flour, and advertising campaigns convinced consumers of its desirability by linking, as Michael said, color to purity. While companies such as Washburn Crosby enriched their flour, nutritional deficiencies led to cases of flour, as well as the dyspepsia, as Anthony Winston explains in his book, Industrial Diet. The flaked cereal, Michael writes, represented a novel industrial manipulation of the grain grown across the plains. I was also, as we were talking here, thinking, was the use of this once discarded kernel a form of culinary recycling? It certainly placed the company on a path toward corporate consolidation in the arena of global industrial food production. What is less clear, however, as the paper reaches its conclusion, is the implication of these changes for the plains generally, or for the farmers who once fed Minneapolis rolling mills. Michael concludes, quote, food systems not only embody particular political economies, but also represent attempts to reorganize material relations over a wide range of spaces with ecological and social effects. I certainly agree with this conclusion, but again, I'd like to see it more thoroughly developed in the context of General Mills and the Great Plains. If people's most essential bond to nature was the food that sustained them, physically, economically, and spiritually, modern agriculture, combined with industrialization and urbanization, has distanced Americans and others from the productive landscapes, leaving consumers with little knowledge of the source of most of their food. Certainly, General Mills has been part of this process. I guess I'd like to see Michael contemplate its role as a global producer and purveyor of these attenuated and different food products, and perhaps its role in leaving consumers uninformed, perhaps purposely so. I was also thinking, as we discussed late 19th century and 20th century agriculture on the plains, whether we should all contemplate a triad of actors who engaged in perhaps what we might call their own green revolution, if I may. We certainly see agricultural production grounded in monocultural systems and an increasingly greater reliance on chemical of pesticides, nitrogen-based fertilizers, and irrigation. In my mind, this triad involves the corporation, and I think Michael does a wonderful job of showing us the corporation's role. Corporations that would eventually evolve into what we call agribusinesses. Second was the university. We rarely contemplate how land-grant institutions, I shouldn't say, that's the wrong way to say it. We don't contemplate enough how land-grant institutions interacted with corporations. Land-grant institutions, extension services, providing essential research, but also educating students who fill the corporate ranks. And the third leg of the triad, of course, is the state. Now, we could make an argument the university is an extension of the state, but certainly the state plays other roles in its many legislative and bureaucratic incarnations. In our workshop, we have surprisingly had little discussion about the states, whether it be the U.S. state or the Canadian state. But the state has often been a force of change on the plains. The multitude of roles that the state has played are too long to enumerate, since I promised brief comments, so I'll skip them here. But they might, maybe it could come up in our discussion tonight. Finally, Michael's paper raises a question that Molly touched on the first day. How do we bound the plains? Is Minneapolis part of the plains by geographic connection or by the connection between the mills and the bonanza farms? If the latter, does it move out of the region as that productive link that bound it becomes looser or obscured? Both Michael and Jake suggest that elements of the plain can extend beyond whatever boundaries we apply. Wheaties and beef connected consumers to the plains through their breakfast bowls and dinner plates, even if consumers remained blithely unaware of this. But for Michael, I'd like to see him more explicit about how this post-Wheaties story is a narrative of the plains, even if it is one of regional marginalization or abandonment. So we'll focus today, and I do want us to focus now on questions from Michael and Jake's papers. But in the end, how will we as collaborators bound the region? Spatially, temporally, according to the resources humans have exploited? Or do production systems and the technical adaptations underlying them define the plains? The collective essays that we have discussed inherently about a place or a place that constitutes the Great Plains, because that is how we as scholars self-identify our topics. Or did this or be consumed with some conflagration? I'm eager to see what themes will emerge in our discussion tonight, but I want to end by thanking Michael and Jake for wonderful papers.
Okay, questions, comments, thoughts? Michael.
So this is a comment, I think, for Jay, but also rose a little bit off of what Kathleen was just talking about bringing the state into the conversation alongside agricultural colleges, and agribusiness, and the petrochemical and agrochemical industries. I was thinking about how that fits together with the 1969 Oklahoma Feed Yards Act. And it seems like so many pieces of that are deliberately crafted in order to bring all those elements in. As you mentioned, that it included, for example, not just the control of pests, but chemical control of pests, which is going to naturally tie in those who produce it and perhaps those who test the chemicals that are then used by feedlot owners. It also brought in, you also mentioned that it included scraping of feedlots, which might prejudice the ability of, to move, to make the landscape more uniform, or even put concrete over that landscape instead, which of course would tie into folks with expertise, mechanical and engineering expertise is beyond that the feedlot owners would possess. And I think there was also some things about making more weather-resistant facilities and certain ways of getting rid of waste as well. So when I think of it, I was thinking actually in your paper as well, Josh, about industrial complex. So we kind of broaden that out. Maybe we have a larger, and this is something you can do before, agricultural industrial complex that would include state actors, that would include agricultural colleges, that would include the USDA, agribusiness, and farmers, people at home, and so forth. And, I just wonder, it's largely a comment that I was milling about as you were looking at your paper. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, or how that sort of fits together with your
Well, and depending on some more expertise, I think you might imagine, or big operations that would have some sort of workforce.
The metropolitan theory, connecting those hubs to the Great Plain Artery, which I think you might have an opportunity to do more, maybe even above the necessity for the Senate volume. We kind of criticized Cronin not doing it now for nature's metropolis. He had an opportunity to do that and kind of fell short. But I think this might really be that opportunity. But undoubtedly, the connections really do show as a Great Plains project, and I think that would be very easily for you to hone out. So I agree with your comments, Rosie. Yeah, I think the challenge for Michael is the postings. I think the printings were right. Connections, right. There's a cultural and financial hinterland that persists because of the group. That's why they got connected. Good. Yeah. Good. Going forward, okay. So thinking more about this core relations that Michael discussed so wonderfully. Jane, I wonder if you could maybe in your paper or maybe just now discuss a little bit more about the importance of transportation industries for the shift from railroads to trucking in this process, because especially if the second part of the argument is that there's a less populated area. So how is the supply chain impacted by that? How does transportation feed into that? Have you found any evidence? The industry itself is big cities where everything can buy rail. Shane Hamilton's going on truck out to it's not just coincidental. Okay. Getting to this question of relationship to the hinterland, I'm just wondering if you have any sense for how much do farmers support weeds, or do we have any meaning, these food changes for what we eat for breakfast? Weeds don't seem like heavy meals that we associate with farming and ranch culture. But what do the farming papers or things like that say about weeds, or do they make it into the advertising? Obviously, they have self-interest in weeds, right? And I'm also thinking about the work of extension services, because that's what starts in 1916 and then after. But do you remember Barbara Haney Martello's book on the women of the Northern Plains, and the last chapter where she really talks about educating women about, I think it's the egg production
material among the farm population, trying to, she kind of argues about trying to civilize the farm population and some resistance. But anyway, it would be interesting to know what wheat farmers thought about Wheaties, and I don't know how you can get at that exactly.
That's the problem of trying to understand the consumer.
Consumption patterns, right? Do they have sales patterns for?
I've been able to find it again.
Also being forage materials.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know when all that started.
I mean, it's important if you think about that particular radio station, which becomes the large AM radio station in Minneapolis, you can hear it all the way to eastern Montana. In other words, that radio station serves that former agricultural interest. So that's one very tenuous potential link. I think the deeper possibilities are in the question of the state of the university, and I might even find things in university materials. As far as targeting women as a market, that predates Betty Crocker, as you saw in those advertisements. And then Betty Crocker morphs over time. There's been some work on Betty Crocker. Morphs into, I mean, this whole kind of subgroup within the company, because the marketing around women and women's wants and needs becomes so sophisticated, starting in the 1930s. And this very simple kind of figure that answers questions on air or gives tips and recipes out over air becomes a much more fascinating, frankly, advertising and marketing tool that has very subtle effects. But I think your point is taken, and it's not just, the gender stuff is not just in Betty Crocker. Right? There's stuff happening everywhere. To me, the tension is generational, between youth and adults. And by the 50s, of course, general cereals include toys. Boxes. So, and I found stuff in their newsletters in the early 1950s. They're doing marketing studies on children. They're sponsoring all these television cartoons in the mid-60s. And they actually say, like, we can now touch every child in America with exposure to General Mills breakfast products by 1966. So, for me, it's this generational question. They have the radio programs in the 30s, and then they do sports things. It's like they're always thinking about how to maximize them. But the University of Minnesota plays a story here, and this is where the state and the university are also really important. I really appreciate that, because it identifies two of the weaknesses of what I just presented. One is, like, what's going on with the shipping railroad freight things. They're huge, and I haven't figured out what exactly is happening. I literally have not been able to pin down what's shifting in terms of the legal rates that Minneapolis millionaires get, and then in the early 20s are taken away at the federal level. In Buffalo, I'm sorry.
Look at what Richard White did in the Spatial District Project.
Some of it.
He did something with freight rates.
Okay.
And not to give you a recreate exactly what he did, but it might give you a way of conceptualizing the spatial conditions.
Well, my understanding, based on what I found, is that it's actually changes in federal law and regulation. So it should be, I should be able to track it down. And the University of Minnesota, which today is a kind of center of public health and also nutrition, with a national reputation, international reputation in those fields. In the late teens, they started working with Washington Crosby around fortifying red flour. There's a research division at General Mills that draws deeply on the University of Minnesota's, once again, as you suggested, a wide range of employees, not just research scientists. So I think there are deep cuts there that become more deeply embedded as you move 30s, 40s, 50s. Yes, Josh.
I have a question for Michael as well, comment / question. It's shifting from gender to race. You have two kind of separate little pieces in your presentation. The new Pillsbury ad that you found last week with, that is oriented in a very important way with Uncle Sam being chicken right. So it's the line of the march of civilization to Uncle Sam. But then you also have Kellogg, who's talking about an overly civilized colon.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, was Kellogg an anti-imperialist? Great question, I have no idea. Maybe that could be something to look into. Was his ideas about whole wheat informed by the kind of political geopolitical atmosphere of the United States around the turn of the century?
In other words, there's something deeply contested about the so-called civilizing project.
Exactly.
That's exactly what it is.
There's the anti-imperial behavior, there's movement for a variety of reasons. But I wonder if there could be something there as you go forward.
Just like Post was involved with rainmaking initiatives in the Texas Panhandle. Yeah. So, that's great. Thank you.
Anyone? Class?
I was just this question with Jake earlier today, and I agree with that.
it's just weird that these cattle be lost slaughtered for decades without anybody complaining. Now, in Essex County, Oklahoma, and it was neighbors not complaining, not physically anyway. But as soon as these platforms, this giant silver one, things each, as soon as it's clear, everybody starts doing it because they're furious. They want nothing to do with it. They're really foul. And it's not a day that they'll be allowed right around. Seeing everything. It doesn't sound great, but just passing by the board is not here. I think that's part of the corporate factor that the people else were not corporate or family, big family operations, but where this seaboard companies, this giant global corporation, does all sorts of things. It's a shitty corporation, but as I started to I think that's part of it as well. There's a change for us, very corporate farming. About that happening. That's what we actually, it's just not always a big place. That could be a chance for you in class too, but for instance, pig farmers are, I think that's a stereotype of being lower class, right? They're dirtier, just because it's not. But I wonder if that's the way to get it to go. The pig farmers can get us a lot more from Japan too. So I just want to give one opportunity if anybody else has a last comment or